Friday night was one of the deepest and most unforgettable nights of my life. The house was cloaked in a strange stillness and peace that seemed to settle deep within me. After a long, exhausting week, all I wanted was rest. As soon as I lay down and closed my eyes, it felt like nothing could disturb me. Since the divorce, I had been a single mum for the past 8 years. There was no bitterness between my ex-husband and me. We had simply gone our separate ways. Raising my son Daniel on my own had been the biggest challenge and accomplishment of my life. He was my world, smart, funny, and incredibly kind. But that night, the weight of being both mum and dad felt heavier than usual. I was so drained that I didn't even have the energy to put on pajamas before collapsing onto the bed. The house was completely silent. Daniel had gone to bed hours earlier after finishing his homework and playing video games. For the first time, I felt like I had a moment to myself. The soft moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting gentle shadows on the walls. Snuggled under the blanket, I enjoyed the warmth and let my mind wander. Life had been calmer lately, a welcome change after a long, tough period. Daniel and I had been through so much together, but we had managed to create a stable and happy life. Daniel was almost 20 now, but the closeness we shared remained the same. He had always been thoughtful and responsible. Sometimes I worried that he carried more responsibility than someone his age should, but I was proud of him nonetheless. Thinking about him made me smile, and I felt lucky to have him in my life. But tonight, I was so tired that my thoughts didn't linger long. Sleep was starting to take over when I heard a faint knock at my bedroom door. At first, I thought it might be a dream, but then the knock came again, soft but clear. Now I was fully awake. From the other side of the door, I heard Daniel's quiet voice. "Mum," he said softly, just loud enough to catch my attention. There was something in his tone that made me sit up and focus. I could see his faint silhouette outlined by the dim light from the hallway. "Daniel, is everything okay?" I asked, my voice still heavy with sleep. He stood by the door for a moment before slowly stepping inside and quietly closing it behind him. His head was down as he said, "I can't sleep." His words immediately made me concerned. Since the divorce, he'd occasionally struggled with falling asleep, but he rarely talked about it. I could tell something was bothering him, though he seemed hesitant to say what it was. That night, I saw something in Daniel's eyes that touched me deeply. There was a sadness so profound, it went beyond words. I patted the empty space on the bed beside me gently and said, "Come here. If you want, you can stay with me tonight." He hesitated for a moment, but then came over and lay down next to me. His tired eyes and slumped shoulders told me he was carrying a heavy burden within. "Do you want to talk about it?" I asked softly. He shook his head, his dark hair falling into his eyes. "No," he said, "I just wanted to be close to you." Those words tugged at my heart. It had been a long time since he'd wanted to be this close. When he was younger, he used to do this often. I reached out, brushing his hair off his forehead, and smiled. "All right," I whispered. "You can stay here as long as you need." We lay there in silence for a while. The room was quiet, and I could tell from his slow, steady breaths that he was starting to feel a little more at ease. Then, suddenly, he spoke so softly that I had to strain to hear him. "Mum, do you ever miss him?" The question caught me off guard, but I knew he was talking about his father. It was a question I'd avoided for years, never quite knowing how to answer it. "Sometimes," I admitted quietly. "But you know, Daniel, things weren't good between us." He nodded, but I could see the curiosity in his eyes, the need to know if things could have been different. "Do you ever think it could have turned out another way?" he asked. I took a deep breath, memories of past regrets surfacing in the corners of my mind. "Maybe," I said. "But we can't change what happened. We have to move forward." He looked down, fiddling with the edge of the blanket, and whispered, "I just wonder sometimes if maybe I could have done something different, you know? Like, if I'd been better." His words shook me to my core. I immediately reached out and pulled him close. Daniel, no, I said firmly. This was not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. He turned away slightly, his voice barely audible. Sometimes it feels like, if I'd been better, maybe Dad wouldn't have left. Tears welled up in my eyes as I wrapped my arms around him tightly. For a moment, he resisted, but then he let himself lean into me, burying his face in my shoulder. Listen to me, Daniel, I said, my voice trembling. Your dad made his own choices. This had nothing to do with you. It was his decision, and it was never your responsibility. With all the love and reassurance I could muster, I added, You've always been more than enough for me, Daniel. You are everything to me. He nodded against my shoulder, but I could still feel the weight of the unspoken pain and guilt he'd been carrying for years. We held on to each other tightly, the silence between us a comforting balm for the wounds we both had. Slowly, I felt his body relax, his breathing deepening as he began to drift off to sleep. As he lay peacefully beside me, I realized that this moment wasn't just bringing him solace, it was giving me peace too. His calmness became mine. Thoughts and memories swirled in my mind like a dark whirlwind. Everything we had endured loomed over my consciousness. Yet, within the quiet embrace, an unfamiliar warmth stirred deep inside me. It was a nameless sensation that seemed to go beyond the ordinary bond of motherhood. I tried focusing on the rhythm of his breathing, as if denying this feeling would make it disappear. But the sensation persisted, lingering like a whisper I couldn't ignore. The early morning light began to softly filter into the room. Daniel lay peacefully asleep beside me. His face was calm and untroubled, as though the worries of the previous night had vanished. I gazed at him for a moment, my heart swelling with affection and pride. Yet, there was a part of that deep emotion that I couldn't brush aside. I quietly slipped out of bed, careful not to disturb him, and made my way to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. The familiar routine of cooking brought a temporary sense of normalcy. Yet, my thoughts kept drifting back to our conversation the previous night. Daniel had always been sensitive, but I hadn't realized the depth to which he had internalized his father's absence. The guilt he carried weighed heavily on my heart. But it wasn't just the guilt. It was the way he had looked at me. There was something unspoken in his eyes, a longing that defied words. Since that night, I had started seeing him in a different light, and it left me in a strange state of confusion. When he finally woke and came into the kitchen, his hair was tousled, and his face still bore traces of sleep. Yet there was a newfound depth in his eyes, something beyond his teenage years. I greeted him with a warm smile, trying to conceal my own emotions. "Breakfast is ready," I said, placing a plate of pancakes in front of him. He sat down and began eating. We shared a peaceful silence, the morning sunlight casting a golden glow across the kitchen. I could feel his gaze on me from time to time. I decided not to bring up the subject of last night. He seemed more at ease, and I didn't want to disrupt the delicate balance we had found. Eventually, he broke the silence. "Mum, thanks for last night. I really needed it." His voice was filled with sincerity. "You don't need to thank me, Daniel," I replied. "I'll always be here for you." He nodded, but his eyes lingered on mine. It felt as though there was an unspoken question in the air. I couldn't quite figure out how to respond, navigating the subtle shifts in our relationship. After breakfast, he lingered by the kitchen counter, tracing light patterns on it with his fingers. "Have you ever thought about how things could have been different?" he asked suddenly, his voice heavy with contemplation. I sighed, the weight of past regrets pressing down on me. "Maybe," I said softly, "but we can't change what's already happened. All we can do is try to move forward." Daniel nodded, but there was a quiet maturity in his eyes, a reflection of unspoken emotions. He stood there for a moment, as if lost in thought, pondering what to say next. His gaze was fixed on his restless fingers. In a soft voice he said, "Sometimes I feel like I could have done something better." His words carried a depth of guilt and self-reproach that pierced straight into my heart. I couldn't hold back and gently placed a hand on his shoulder, pulling him into a hug. Daniel, you've done nothing wrong. None of this is your fault, I reassured him, my voice filled with emotion. He averted his gaze and said in a trembling voice, "Sometimes I feel like if I had been better, maybe he wouldn't have." His voice broke. Tears welled up in my eyes as I pulled him closer, holding him tightly. He hesitated for a moment, but then he relaxed into my embrace, burying his face into my shoulder. "Daniel, listen to me," I said firmly but tenderly. "Your father's choices were his own. You have always been more than enough. His leaving had nothing to do with you." He nodded slowly, and I felt the tension in his body begin to ease. His shoulders softened, his posture against me loosening. In that moment, a strange warmth spread through me. It was a blend of affection and connection, a bond that seemed to extend beyond the traditional roles of mother and son. We had both felt something, though neither of us could fully understand it. I let the moment linger, without questions or explanations. I wasn't sure where this new intimacy would lead us, but I could feel that our lives were changing, and this was just the beginning. In the quiet of the night, the warmth of his embrace enveloped me. The delicate balance of our relationship teetered on the edge of becoming something new. The uncertainty of what this transformation might mean sent a tremor of unease through me. Yet, there was an undeniable sense of anticipation, a recognition that this was the start of a journey into the unknown. Dawn arrived gently. The soft rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains, waking me from my sleep. Beside me, Daniel slept peacefully. His face was calm, and the burdens of the previous night seemed to have eased. I looked at him for a moment, my heart swelling with maternal love. Yet beneath that familiar affection, another emotional undercurrent flowed. It was the same strange feeling that had unsettled me the night before. Carefully, so as not to disturb him, I slipped out of bed and made my way to the kitchen. As I prepared breakfast, my thoughts kept returning to our late-night conversation. Daniel had always been a sensitive soul, but I had never realized the extent to which he had carried the weight of his father's absence. The hidden pain he had harbored for so long was now a heavy burden on my heart. But even more than that, his demeanor had changed. The way he sought comfort in my arms had a depth to it, a closeness that seemed to transcend the traditional boundaries of a mother-son relationship. If I was honest with myself, I had felt it too. His presence had stirred something deep within me, but I pushed the thought aside and focused on the task at hand. "He's just a boy," I reminded myself. I reminded myself that he was my son, but the feeling lingered, like a constant whisper that refused to quiet down. Daniel finally woke from his sleep, rubbing the drowsiness from his eyes. His tousled hair gave him the look of youthful innocence, yet there was a newfound maturity in his gaze, a glimpse of the man he was becoming. I greeted him with a warm smile, trying to conceal the emotions from the night before. "Breakfast is ready," I said cheerfully, placing a plate of golden pancakes in front of him. He muttered a soft acknowledgement, took his seat, and eagerly began eating. We ate in comfortable silence, the morning sunlight bathing the kitchen in a warm glow. Occasionally, I could feel his eyes on me, but I stayed silent, unwilling to dive into the complexities of the previous night's revelations. He seemed more at ease, more like himself, and I didn't want to disrupt the fragile peace we had found. Eventually, he broke the silence. His voice was filled with gratitude. "Thanks for last night, Mum. I really needed it." His vulnerability caught me off guard. "You never have to thank me, Daniel," I assured him. "I'll always be here for you." He nodded, but there was an unspoken question in his gaze. His eyes held a depth, an intensity that extended beyond familiar comfort. It felt as if there was a shift in the bond we shared, a subtle yet undeniable change. Later that day, Daniel retreated to his room, engrossed in homework and video games, while I busied myself with chores. Yet there was a noticeable change in the atmosphere between us. It wasn't overt or tangible, but rather a subtle shift, a quiet tension, an unspoken acknowledgement of a deeper connection. As the day turned into evening, my thoughts drifted back to Daniel. I thought about how he was transitioning from a boy to a young man, about the closeness we had shared the night before. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my feelings for him had grown beyond the boundaries of maternal affection. That evening, after dinner, we sat together on the sofa to watch a movie. The room was dimly lit, the flickering images on the screen casting shadows that danced along the walls. We were mostly quiet, content in each other's presence. But as the movie progressed, I became acutely aware of his closeness, the way his arm occasionally brushed against mine. Each small movement made my heart race, and though I tried to focus on the film, the tension between us was undeniable. Midway through the movie, he leaned closer, his arm pressed against mine. This time he didn't pull away. The warmth of his skin against mine sent a slight shiver through me. I glanced at him, and our eyes met. There was a newfound intensity in his gaze, a reflection of the emotions I had been trying to suppress all day. Slowly, I reached out and held his hand. Our fingers intertwined. He didn't resist. Instead, he gently squeezed my hand, his thumb tracing slow circles on my skin. That simple gesture sent a ripple through me, a feeling that was both familiar and entirely new. We sat like that for a while, our hands entwined in the dim light, a silent acknowledgement of the shifting dynamics in our relationship. When the movie ended, we remained on the sofa, ignoring the credits as they rolled. I rested my head on his shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his chest as he breathed. It was a small gesture, yet it felt deeply intimate, a quiet acceptance of the new closeness blossoming between us. "Mom," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. "Yes." "I'm glad you're here," he said softly. His simple words resonated deeply in my heart. I was glad too, glad for this unexpected closeness, this new intimacy. It was both unsettling and beautiful. During the movie, Daniel gently leaned his arm against mine, and this time he didn't pull away. The warmth of his skin against mine sent a subtle shiver through me. I glanced at him, and our eyes met. There was a newfound intensity in his gaze, a reflection of the emotions I had unknowingly been suppressing all day. Slowly, I reached out and held his hand. Our fingers intertwined. He didn't resist. Instead, he gently squeezed my hand, his thumb tracing slow, deliberate circles on my palm. That simple gesture stirred something within me, a feeling that was both familiar and startlingly new. We sat like that for a while, our hands intertwined in the dim light, a silent acknowledgement of the shifting dynamics between us. It was a pivotal moment, a shared understanding that transcended the boundaries of our roles. The movie ended, but we remained seated, paying no attention to the credits rolling on the screen. I rested my head on his shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing, the rise and fall of his chest. It was a small gesture, yet it carried profound meaning, a quiet acceptance of the deepening connection blossoming between us. "Mom," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. "Yes," I replied softly. "I'm glad you're here," he said. His simple yet heartfelt words struck a chord deep within me. I was glad too, grateful for this new closeness that felt both unexpected and extraordinary. Later that night, as I lay wrapped in the warmth of his embrace, a profound realization washed over me. The delicate balance of our relationship was shifting, sliding into uncharted territory. A tremor of uncertainty coursed through me, wondering what this transformation might mean for us. Yet, amid the apprehension, there was an undeniable sense of anticipation. This felt like the beginning of a new journey, one we had yet to fully understand. The dawn arrived gently. The soft rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains, stirring me awake. Beside me, Daniel lay peacefully asleep, his face calm and unburdened by the weight of the previous night. I looked at him for a moment, and my heart swelled with affection and pride. Yet, beneath that familiar love, a new undercurrent of emotion coursed through me. It was the same strange sensation that had unsettled me the night before. Carefully, so as not to disturb him, I slipped out of bed and made my way to the kitchen. As I stood by the stove flipping pancakes, my thoughts kept drifting back to our late-night conversation. Daniel had always been sensitive, but I had never realized how deeply he had internalized his father's absence. The pain he had hidden for so long now weighed heavily on my heart. But even more than that, I noticed a change in his demeanor. The way he had sought solace in my arms carried a depth, a closeness that went beyond the traditional bounds of a mother-son relationship. If I were honest with myself, I felt it too. His presence stirred something within me, something I couldn't quite define. But I pushed the thought aside and focused on the task at hand. He's just a boy, I reminded myself. I reminded myself that he was my son, but the feeling lingered like a soft whisper, refusing to quiet down. Daniel eventually emerged from his room, wiping the sleep from his eyes. His tousled hair was a picture of youthful innocence, yet there was a newfound maturity in his gaze, a glimpse of the man he was becoming. I greeted him with a warm smile, trying to mask the emotions of the previous night. "Breakfast is ready," I chirped, placing a plate of golden pancakes before him. He quietly took his seat and began eating. We ate in comfortable silence as the morning sunlight bathed the kitchen in a soft, warm glow. Occasionally I could feel his eyes on me, but I remained quiet, unwilling to revisit the complexities of the previous night's revelations. He seemed more at ease, more like himself, and I didn't want to disrupt the fragile peace we had found. Eventually, he broke the silence. His voice was filled with gratitude. "Thank you for last night, Mum. I really needed it." His vulnerability surprised me. "You never have to thank me, Daniel," I reassured him. "I'll always be here for you." He nodded, but there was an unspoken question lingering in his gaze. His eyes held a depth and intensity that went beyond the familiar comfort of our mother-son bond. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. Daniel retreated to his room, busy with homework and video games, while I immersed myself in chores. Yet, the atmosphere between us had subtly changed. It was an intangible shift, like an unspoken acknowledgement of a deeper connection between us. As the day turned into evening, my thoughts returned to Daniel. I reflected on his transition from a boy to a young man and the closeness we had shared the previous night. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my feelings for him had grown beyond the usual confines of maternal affection. That evening, after dinner, we sat on the sofa to watch a movie. The room was dimly lit, with images flickering on the screen and shadows dancing on the walls. We sat quietly, content in each other's presence. As the movie progressed, I became acutely aware of his closeness. His arm brushed against mine occasionally, and with every subtle contact, my heartbeat quickened. I tried to focus on the film, but the tension between us was unmistakable. Midway through the movie, he rested his arm against mine and didn't pull away this time. The warmth of his skin sent a slight shiver through me. I glanced at him, and our eyes met. There was a new intensity in his gaze, reflecting the emotions I had been trying to suppress all day. Slowly, I reached out and held his hand. Our fingers intertwined. He didn't resist. Instead, he gently squeezed my hand, his thumb tracing slow circles on my skin. That simple gesture stirred something deep within me. It was both familiar and entirely new. We sat like that for a while, wrapped in the dim light, silently acknowledging the shifting dynamics of our relationship. It was a pivotal moment, an unspoken understanding that transcended the traditional boundaries of our familial roles. When the movie ended, we stayed where we were, ignoring the credits rolling on the screen. I rested my head on his shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. "Mom," Daniel whispered, his voice soft yet steady. "Yes?" I replied gently. "I'm glad you're here," he said. His words sank deep into my heart. I was glad too, grateful for this new closeness, unexpected and yet profoundly meaningful. I rested my head on his shoulder, feeling the gentle rhythm of his breathing. The slow rise and fall of his chest brought a comforting warmth that spread through me. It was such a simple gesture, yet it carried an undeniable sense of intimacy, a silent acknowledgement of the bond growing between us. "Mum," Daniel whispered, his voice so soft it was barely audible. "Yes?" I replied gently. "I'm glad you're here," he said. His words touched something deep within me. They were simple, yet they resonated with a profound emotion that awakened an unspoken truth in my heart. I was glad too, grateful for his presence, for this unexpected closeness that felt both unfamiliar and exhilarating. In that moment, I felt truly alive for the first time. There was no pretense, no guilt, just the pure and undeniable truth of our shared love. It was a love born of years of trust and shared understanding, a connection deeper than blood. It felt as natural as breathing, as inevitable as the sunrise. We lay there in silence, the only sound the soft rhythm of our breaths. Daniel's gaze met mine, his eyes filled with a warmth that melted my heart. "Are we okay?" he asked softly, his voice a gentle caress in the stillness. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment, overwhelmed by emotions that defied words. "Yes," I whispered, my voice heavy with unspoken truth. Later that night, after the dinner dishes were cleared and the house had settled into a peaceful quiet, Daniel and I found ourselves on the back porch. The air was crisp and cool, and the night sky stretched above us, a canvas of stars glimmering like diamonds. For the first time in weeks, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. We didn't say much, but words weren't necessary. Just sitting there with him, sharing the serene beauty of the night, was enough. There was no urgency, no pressure, only a comfortable silence that spoke volumes. Whatever this was between us, it was unfolding naturally, and I was content to let it blossom at its own pace. Daniel reached out and took my hand. His touch sent a warmth through me, spreading like wildfire. I smiled softly and gently squeezed his hand, and we sat there, fingers intertwined, bathed in the soft glow of starlight. It was a love that defied definitions, a connection that transcended the boundaries of familial roles. In that moment, under the vast expanse of the night sky, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. As the days turned into weeks, the intimacy between us wove itself more deeply into the fabric of our daily lives. We didn't need to define or label it. It simply was what it was. Our lingering touches, the way our eyes met in quiet moments, and the shared creation of a world that belonged solely to us. With each passing day, the bond between us grew stronger. The internal conflict I had initially felt was replaced by a sense of belonging, a feeling that I was exactly where I needed to be. Daniel was no longer just my son, he was my companion, my confidant. Our relationship had transformed into something beautiful, fulfilling a need we hadn't even realized existed. The full realization of our bond struck me on a rainy autumn afternoon. The sky was a canvas of stormy grey, and the steady rhythm of raindrops played against the windows. Daniel and I were curled up on the living room sofa, wrapped in a blanket. The fire crackled warmly in the hearth, filling the room with a soft glow. Daniel rested against me, his head on my shoulder. I gently ran my fingers through his hair, savouring the quiet intimacy of the moment. The rain blurred the windows, isolating us from the outside world, creating a sense of solitude in our small universe. I could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing, and without a word, I knew he felt the same shift I did. The undeniable pull towards something deeper. He lifted his head, his eyes meeting mine. In that moment, the truth of our love resonated between us. This wasn't just love, it was a bond that transcended traditional roles. Daniel's voice was a soft whisper, heavy with emotion. I love you. I stayed silent, waiting, knowing that whatever he said next would change everything. I don't just love you because you're my mum, he said. I love you for who you are, for everything about you. And I don't know if it's right or wrong, but I can't help it. His words washed over me like a warm wave, filling the room with a love so profound it made my heart ache in the most beautiful way. I had always felt his emotions, but hearing him voice them gave them a new depth, making them even more real. I squeezed his hand gently, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my fingers. Daniel, I whispered, my voice trembling slightly. I love you too. I've always loved you, but this feels different. He searched my eyes, looking for reassurance, for an answer to the unspoken question that lingered between us. I don't know what this means, I continued, but I feel it too, and it doesn't feel wrong. It feels completely right. A soft smile touched his lips, and my heart swelled with joy. It was a happiness I had never known before. I'm glad you feel this way, he whispered softly, because I don't know what I'd do if you weren't here. Instead of replying, I raised my hand to his cheek, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath my fingers. We'll figure it out together, I reassured him gently. We sat in silence for a while, our eyes locked. The only sounds were the soft patter of rain and the gentle crackling of the fire. Words felt unnecessary. Everything that needed to be said had already been spoken in the quiet moments between us. Slowly, Daniel leaned toward me, never breaking his gaze. Hesitantly, he kissed me, a soft, tender kiss filled with all the love and longing we had been holding back for so long. There was no urgency, no rush, just the pure expression of the deep connection we shared. When he pulled back, his eyes were filled with emotion. I knew then that we had crossed a boundary, one from which there was no turning back. But instead of fear, I felt a profound sense of peace, a certainty that this was exactly where we were meant to be. He pulled me into his arms, holding me close. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and the fire cast a warm glow over our embrace. In that moment, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of soft touches, whispered conversations, and gentle kisses. We didn't discuss the future or the implications of this new love. What mattered was the present, the shared intimacy of that moment. As the rain continued its gentle rhythm, I marveled at how quickly our relationship had transformed. Daniel had grown from a boy into a man, and in doing so, our bond had evolved into something unexpected, something beautiful. That night, Daniel came to my room again, but this time there was no hesitation. He climbed into bed beside me, pulling me into his arms. This wasn't the embrace of a mother and son. It was the embrace of lovers, two souls bound together in a connection deeper than words. I rested my head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. It was a symphony of love and satisfaction, a peace I hadn't felt in years. In that moment, I realized that whatever this was, I wasn't willing to lose it. I was ready to embrace it fully. Daniel and I had always been close, but now we had become something more, something that defied conventional definitions. We were partners, lovers, two souls bound by a love that transcended boundaries. As I drifted off to sleep, a smile played on my lips. It was madness, I knew, but it felt extraordinary,